Good day, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into my video today. This is absolutely an iconic little documentary. It was put together way back in the early 1970s. You're going to see some really cool old footage, but I would really encourage everybody to please give this a watch. What I'm going to do is the documentary was very, very long and long-winded, to say the least. They went into, some eyewitness accountings. It's very hard to watch. They took way too long on way too many shots. So I'm just going to cut this short and to really get to the nitty-gritty, the absolutely John Green, Albert Ostman, Roger Patterson, Grover Krantz right in the very beginning. So I'm going to give some perspectives that have never been heard before. I have a significant amount of information and knowledge about the species commonly referred to Sasquatch, and I'm going to punch that into this documentary and talk about some amazing things. This is such an important, iconic piece of Bigfoot history, so please stay tuned, enjoy, because there's some incredible moments coming right up.
I'm Jay Smith, and it's my job to give you a first-hand report on Bigfoot. I've been here in this camp for several days. We're told it's Bigfoot country. From this camp, a vast wilderness area is now being searched for the Bigfoot. This is Ron Olson. Ron's from Springfield, Oregon, and he heads up expeditions looking for the Bigfoot. Ron, tell me, just what is a Bigfoot?
Excuse me a minute. Craig, hold that thing up a minute. Bigfoot, or Sasquatch as he's called in Canada, is a giant, hair-covered, human-like creature that's been reported more and more throughout the mountains of the northwestern United States and Canada.
How big do they run?
Many sightings has revealed this creature to be between 7 to 9 feet tall and 600 to 900 pounds.
Well,
Very impressive to hear that I see these proportions even way back in these days, in the infancy of this discovery process. The proportions are, I consider those pretty much spot on. Male, female. Females around 7 feet, males around 9 feet. The weights are correct. So this person, Ronald D. Olson, and there's many people in this documentary that seemed like lifelong Sasquatch/Bigfoot researchers that really spent their lives and didn't really even accomplish much. Names that I don't even know. But there are names in here of some men that are absolutely icons, and still I stand on their great shoulders, and we're going to get into lots of them today, so let's keep watching.
well, now, let's hear the words of some people who've had some first-hand experiences with Bigfoot.
In 1924, Fred Beck and 4 other miners were in a cabin in the backwoods located in Washington State near St. Helens. There were 4 or 5 creatures who approached the cabin during the night and proceeded to harass the miners by throwing rocks and pounding on the walls and doors of the cabin.
In those days was big shoulders and small hips and hairy. And they was, I'd call them a black turned brown by the sun, the outside hair. That's what I would call them to be. And muscular. And they looked like they was about 8, 9 foot tall. I no way to tell.
Another miner and prospector, Albert Ostman, in 1924 was camped near Toba Inlet in British Columbia. While asleep in a sleeping bag, he was picked up and packed several miles. Daylight found him in a small valley encircled by cliffs. This was home for a family of these creatures. He was able to escape after 6 days by getting them sick on a box of snuff. Now let's listen to Mr. Ostman's experience.
Well, there was 4 of them, and none of them look alike. There was what I call the old man, because I had no scale or any rules for measurement, but he was at least 8 feet tall, and must have at least 800 pounds. But what I call the old lady, she couldn't have been over about 600-700 pounds. She was probably 7 feet tall, and they were all covered with hair.
Here we go. I'm going to be controversial. I think Albert Ostman's story, he signed like an affidavit in front of a judge and he did all this stuff. I think his story is absolutely preposterous. from what I know about Sasquatch, everything he says is just absolute crap. They dragged him back. He tricked him with snuff. You couldn't trick a being that had a heightened sense of smell to eat snuff and then run away. His whole story just sounds absolutely ridiculous to me. Is it possibly true? Possibly. But just based on my knowledge and information, and after having listened it from the mouth of the man, looking into his eyes as he spoke in this documentary, I'm very, very convinced, I would say 99% likely, that his story is absolutely, completely untrue.
By 1956, there had been several such reported sightings, which had been reported in small local newspapers. Mr. John Green, publisher of a newspaper at Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia, began investigating some of these sightings. Here is John Green to report on a sighting he investigated in 1957.
When I first came here in about 1957, it was still pretty well open. But all this has grown up since then. Now, what happened at that time was that Mrs. George Chapman, who lived in a house down by the river behind me here, she was in the house and the children were outside. One of them came in and told her that there was a cow coming out of the woods. So she looked out and she saw this man-like thing, but about 8 feet tall and completely covered with hair like a bear. And she knew it to be a Sasquatch. This was, quite a well-known thing to the Indian people. And she was frightened, so she took the children, ran down to the river, and then through the graveyard, which is right behind me here, and came out just about here onto the track, and then ran on down to Ruby Creek. Now, she'd really only had one quick look at the thing, so it wouldn't be that convincing a story, except that a lot of people immediately went back there and saw these enormous tracks. Mr. Tifting, of course, was one of them, and can describe just what the tracks were like and what they did.
Well, he came through the bush into the shed, or the lean-to of the house, and there was a barrel of dried fish with smoked salmon, rather. And he broke the barrel, and there was some fish eaten there and thrown around. And then he went down the riverbank and apparently took a drink and then come back up on the other side of the house, through the garden patch and up to CPR fence and stepped with 1 foot on that side of the fence and 1 foot on this side of the fence. I can walk right over it. And the footprints was about 18 inches, And then he went across there and over to the next fence there and went right up the hillside. And that's as far as we could follow it.
That story entirely has a ring of truth to it. It sounds very authentic to me with the evidence and what I'm hearing in the story. It just makes sense from the behavior that I've noticed. I'd like to make a note, though, that is John Green. So a man who, in the last years of his life, was a strong adversary to me. What happened was when my documentary played with video 2 and 3, he sent 2 people up to the city that I lived in Canada. He couldn't come himself because he was too old, and they thought it was a joke, and then my footage was a joke. This is video 2 and 3 of my footage, and then went back to him and reported that to him, and then after that, he just had nothing good to say about me at all until he passed away. But that's all whatever, water under the bridge. I respect what he did. He was a mentor to Jeff Meldrum, they did some really great work together, and he wrote some good books, and I just have nothing but respect for the man. If in all other things, especially, he spent decades of his life, over 40 years, researching and studying this and never saw Sasquatch. So total respect to him, admiration to his books and the work that he did to help this discovery process move forward.
As John Green and others began to seriously investigate reported sightings, they found that many aspects of the sightings were the same. One of the first detailed drawings of a Sasquatch was made by Mrs. Myrtle Walton of British Columbia. Her father, William Rowe, had the unique experience of being able to watch a Sasquatch at close range. Mrs. Walton now tells us how it came about.
My dad come and asked me to draw a picture of this animal or human for him. He called it a Sasquatch, so he could send it to this John Green. And I drawed the picture for him, and just exactly the way he told me he wanted it drawn. There was a few things he changed on it, like he made the arms a lot heavier, and the head was different, and the breast was different, and the back part was different. So between the two of us, we patched it all up, and we sent it to John Green.
As the interested investigators became better known, there were more and more sightings and evidences being submitted to them. Mr. Richard Grover, another investigator, reports on a sighting in a residential area just outside of Tacoma, Washington.
This is the site of the Fife Heights incident. One morning, approximately 4 o'clock, Dick Hancock and his friend came along this road, stopping the car right here when they saw a huge creature behind that sign over there. It was so tall, its head was above the street sign. The creature took approximately 3 steps, crossing the road. It was blinded by the headlights, and it almost bumped into this sign. As it sidestepped, it caught this sign before it went down over the hill. This is the sign that the creature struck, and it bent it like this, leaving these indentations or scratch marks. It has been estimated by experts that it took 500 foot-pounds to bend this material.
A few years after Mrs. Walton made the sketch for her father, she and her husband had a personal experience with a Bigfoot. This is what they report.
Well, I think my wife and I have heard the Sasquatch. There's a swamp fairly close to the house here where we can walk out of an evening, and quite often we go down to watch moose. And one night we were down there, and there wasn't any moose around, which was strange because in the summer every night there's moose in the swamp. And it was just before dusk when across the swamp we heard this screaming cry.
There were 3 cries, screams, or horrible screams, or whatever they was. One after the other. There was silence between, and everything was just dead quiet afterwards. Just made the hair crawl on the back of your neck.
We didn't see anything, but I've heard every animal that lives in the locality at different times, and it wasn't any of those. And if I was asked to describe the sound, I'd say it was a kind of a screaming cry, and it seemed to have anguish in it. Anguish was the thing that stuck with me.
Here is an approximation to the sound that they reported hearing that evening.
To me, honestly, a story like that really it's not given enough weight, because people like that, they're indigenous. They live there. They're born and raised there. He knows the sounds of animals. He's spent his whole life there. For him to come and say something was out in the wilderness in a spot where there are no people in my home area, and it was something I've never heard, what's out there? It was a Sasquatch. And he knew it. His wife knew it. And just powerful evidence to me. There should never be, if Fish and Wildlife truly are stewards of all wildlife, and an indigenous human being like that, a man who has lived there and has that knowledge, comes up, many people, hundreds of people, now thousands of people have come forward and said, tens of thousands, and say there's something out there that is unexplained. What is it? Fish and Wildlife does nothing. And if they're not doing their job, it's up to people like us to come and step up and, or try to sue them to get them to do their job, which is why I went to court over this. But I put a lot of weight in that. I find that to be a very authentic accounting, live interaction of a Sasquatch, period.
Some of the investigators began to call on the scientific community for facts which might put the puzzle together and prove or disprove the reports. Here is Dr. Charles Guiguet, curator of mammals at the Provincial Museum in Victoria, British Columbia, who reflects the dilemma in which he and his companions found themselves.
In my opinion, the Sasquatch, the Yeti, the abominable snowman, the Winnebago, the Catabrasaurus, Loch Ness Monster, Ogopogo, all of these animals belong in the realm of folklore and mythology. And my reason for saying this is simply that there is no concrete proof, evidence, that any of these creatures ever existed on the face of this planet. No one has ever produced a specimen, complete or incomplete, to prove that any of these animals have ever lived.
He sits in his comfortable office, naysaying to people that are out there, boots on the ground, living indigenously, seeing, eyewitnessing, and producing evidence in their eyewitness accounting that puts people in jail, and rightly so, because that's evidence. And the tracks, the broken signs, the history, the oral history in Native culture. To be arrogant like that is something that I just can't respect whatsoever. That's not real science. To think that you know it all is preposterous. We're nowhere near that point. We got a long ways to go, and we got a lot to do.
The scientists were asking for physical evidence to support the stories of the reported creature. In 1958, Gerald Crew was building a new road in a wilderness area in Northern California. For several mornings in a row, he noted there were huge, human-like footprints around his bulldozer. He obtained some plaster of Paris and made casts of them. Here now was physical evidence of something that made tracks. Some scientists say they are made by a prankster. Here is another investigator, Rene Dahinden.
No scientist ever came out in the bush to look at the footprints which we found. No scientists ever studied these tracks. They're sitting there saying they're faked without ever having seen footprints in the area where we found them. No technical evaluation was ever made. In my opinion, after having seen 3,000 footprints myself of 6 different sizes, I came to the conclusion this tracks to be made by a living foot, a creature with a foot like this, a Sasquatch, rather than a man with artificial feet.
Rene Dahinden. Wow, what do we say about Rene Dahinden? I agree with his perspectives here, but not much else. He was a powerful detractor of science, which I am not. I embrace science. John Bitternagel, Grover Krantz, who I never met, Jeff Meldrum, amazing icons in this field. He would often call the PhDs PH dummies, which I found very offensive and inappropriate. It was very brave of John Bitternagel, and it is very brave of Jeff Meldrum to come forward and work towards the scientific proof of this. And the people that have followed in Rene Dahinden's footsteps, I won't name their names, but they really do nothing. They've done nothing. They just create turmoil and friction between researchers. Rene was very critical of Grover Krantz as an example. He was just an absolute jerk to him. And I think Rene was just a jerk. That's why he was alone. And he never saw a Sasquatch. That says something about him. So I don't have much respect for the man in general, but I'm trying not to hate on people too much. So it's very personal with John Bitternagel. He called John Bitternagel a PH dummy. And yeah, I have a problem with that. And I'd have stood up to Rene and told that to his little chump ass face. Because John Bitternagel was a great man and did great things. And you know, it is nice, I have to say, that, you know, Rene did do stuff that his testimony there is valuable, but he was a real ass about it. So maybe I have to just be a nicer guy too and try to have some respect for what he accomplished. So I'm learning as I go along here. So try not to take it too personally, because it is personal. You're not going to find any one of these men, John Bitternagel, Jeff Meldrum, Rene Dahinden, John Green, Peter Burns. I could just, the names go on and on. It's personal, guys. It really is personal. You put your life into this, you know, it matters. And when someone gives you attitude like that, it's human nature, but yeah, it can get personal, you know, and it's just the way it is. That's why we're passionate. That's why we're crazy. Doing this, pushing forward in spite of all the friction that we face, we push forward so it makes...
The task of the investigator has not been an easy one. On one hand, he is greeted by individuals who just saw Bigfoot and believes it. On the other, he is met with cries of derision and fakery. There is beginning to be a new line of thinking from the scientific community on this subject. Here is Dr. Grover Krantz, physical anthropologist at Washington State University, which explains his view.
As a physical anthropologist, I've decided that these creatures do, in all likelihood, exist. The evidence of the footprints is what I find the most convincing. This is an example of one footprint. This is a plaster cast, which shows a crippled individual. The foot was twisted, and two bulges appear, calloused structures on the outside edge of the foot, and correspond to gaps in the bones, which I've reconstructed here. If this was faked, the person doing it had to be an absolute expert in human anatomy.
So much respect for Grover Krantz. Stand on his work. Jeff Meldrum stands on his work. And one thing I can say as derogatory about Grover Krantz, though, is he was about killing them, which respect for the opinion at the time. A body needed to come back. A body was the thing. A body was the absolute proof. And he wanted to have one shot, and that's just not something that we can do. It's just not something that needs to happen. It's not responsible. But just total respect and admiration for him. He just did so much, and his testimony means a lot to me, because these perspectives back in these days were very important, especially when it comes to one of the most important things of the day. I'm going to talk about it after this sequence plays. The Patterson footage, that's legitimate, real footage. It has so many ties into me and what I do and to this discovery process. It's such an important, iconic piece of information. Let's watch this sequence, please.
Perhaps the most startling and far-reaching event in the recent history of Bigfoot hunting happened to a long-time investigator by the name of Roger Patterson. In October of 1967, he and a friend were in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California to investigate a reported sighting of two creatures. Suddenly his horse shied as a large creature stood erect from behind a log where it had been drinking from the creek. Patterson grabbed a 16mm camera from the saddlebag and jumped from the back of the rearing horse to take the following pictures. Let's hear in Patterson's words exactly what happened that day.
As I walked across the sandbar, I was able to get some fairly good footage of it. It turned a couple of times and looked at us. And as it turned, it seemed to give me the impression that it didn't want anything to do with it. It didn't run, it didn't act scared, but yet it acted leery of us.
Patterson thought that he had proved once and for all that the creatures existed. But he found that even the film was in question. As a result, the footage was submitted to experts in various fields. Among them was Janis Prohaska. Active in the motion picture industry since 1939 as an impersonator of animals of the ape family, Mr. Prohaska was convinced that Roger Patterson had filmed a living, wild creature.
The movement is the only thing what throwed me a little bad, because he moved a little bit more like a man than an animal. Because you could see all the muscles on the body and the whole movement. It didn't move like a costume at all. And the size of it was enormous big size, so I don't know if they find a big man like that.
Mr. Prohaska, you mentioned that the creature did not move, as if it were a costume. Do you think it would be possible to create such a costume?
That would be a difficult... I don't think so. Because that costume, if it would be a costume, that would have taken such a long time to put the hair. You should put the hair by glue them on. That would take about 10 hours, the whole makeup job. And it looked to me very, very real. I'm doing this since 1939, and if that was a costume, that was the best I have ever seen.
A couple things here that's really important. I saw in another documentary where Grover Krantz talked about his interview with Roger Patterson. Also, Bob Gimlin was out there too, who I've met and spoken with at length, and that footage is absolutely real. I asked Bob Gimlin questions. I really grilled him, and there's no way that video was faked. I asked him questions he's never been asked before, being somebody who's boots on the ground, who's had experience with actually filming Sasquatch and looking at footage, and having been there and done that. I was able to ask Bob questions that nobody's ever asked him in 50 years. And he hit everything spot on perfectly. So there's that. Then, during this documentary, what I found notes from one of the producers that said they actually couldn't, you notice they don't really show Roger Patterson talking. He was not an intellectual man. He was a very simple man. Let me tell you, and this was also substantiated by Grover Krantz. Grover talked to him about stuff that was in the footage, and Patterson didn't even know what he was saying. That's a quote unquote from Grover Krantz, knowing that it would take a brilliant man to have hoaxed this. Brilliant. Did you hear what that Hollywood expert had to say? That's a Hollywood expert with decades of experience saying that technology just doesn't exist. And I can further substantiate that by saying in 1968, a year after this footage was done, Planet of the Apes, the very first one that came out, cost $6 million at the time. What is that, like $50 million? Charlton Heston starred in it, and it was a blockbuster hit. It made $33 million, which was the equivalent of what, $200 million today? So it was a huge blockbuster film with millions of dollars. And look at this. That was the best they could do. The best, like that was Oscar award winning, the best makeup artists in the world made those apes. And it's not anywhere near what you're seeing in the Patterson footage. It was real. Like, ladies and gentlemen, it's real. It's proof. And that's one of the most important pieces of this whole little documentary. I'm going to end this here today. There'll be more next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Amazing stuff. I love this historical stuff. I'll be looking more into it because I'm really enjoying going to this. Respect for the men and women that worked on this discovery long before I was even born. So really exciting stuff. So stay tuned for more.